Și sunt unii care le plâng de milă câtorva golani care provoacă dezordine în centrul orașului.
A fost odată ca-n povești, a fost în România o gașcă mare de golani în ce-au alungat sclavia. Noi nu ne-am confundat nici când cu oamenii de bine, numiți și neocomuniști și fără de rușine. Mai bine haimana decât trădător, mai bine huligan decât dictator, mai bine golan decât activist, mai bine mort decât comunist. Vrem libertate, nu comunism și nici schimbări de formă, și de aceea securiști să nu ne puneți normă. Noi nu vrem neocomunism, nici neolibertate, democrații originale și nici minciuni sfruntate. Mai bine haimana decât trădător, mai bine huligan decât dictator, mai bine golan decât activist, mai bine mort decât comunist. Ne-ați întrebat ce vrem aici, dar știe toată țara, noi susținem punctul 8 de la Timișoara. A căzut 473 ce ținea TVR, legat în lanțurile ei, dar tot degeaba e. Mai bine haimana decât trădător, mai bine huligan decât dictator, mai bine golan decât activist, mai bine mort decât comunist. Alegeri fără comuniști, fără nomenclatură, și nu vă temeți de golani fără coloratură. Din cei care au murit aici ne-am reîntors năluci, să nu mai fie cum a fost măcelul de atunci. Mai bine haimana decât trădător, mai bine huligan decât dictator, mai bine golan decât activist, mai bine mort decât comunist. Mai bine haimana decât trădător, mai bine huligan decât dictator, mai bine golan decât activist, mai bine mort decât comunist. Mai bine haimana decât trădător, mai bine huligan decât dictator, mai bine golan decât activist, mai bine mort decât comunist.
Well, I'm Ciprian Ivanof. I used to live in Minneapolis. You may know from other episodes of Ty's channel that I was born in communist Romania, born in an ethnic Russian family, got sick, taken away by the doctor, put in an orphanage. Not a great environment. Got adopted by an American, lived in Texas, then Washington, D.C. in the 90s, where I lived in the bad part of town. Moved to Wisconsin, then back to Romania, and I got to see the fun of post-communist Romania. And I lived in working class areas, not the expat enclaves. Then I came to Minneapolis for undergrad, where I studied history and political science at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. So when people talk about Minneapolis and the riots, that's an area I actually know something about. I also know something because I used to be in the Minnesota National Guard. So there's a whole history there.
Cyprian, that's a fascinating snippet of your experience. We could probably just talk about your past for quite a while. But I do have some specific National Guard questions that I can save for later, but we could ease into that. I'm happy to follow your lead.
Okay. If it's about specific people, that might be best handled outside of the recording.
Sure. Okay, so if I was curious about if you'd been active when the Super Bowl was in town, I believe in the mid-2000s, give or take, would that be
No, I enlisted in 2008.
Okay. All
Guys
right. Then.
from my unit were activated to help protect the 2008 RNC.
Okay. Wow. Now, I don't know much about that event. Was it particularly violent or disruptive?
There were plots to disrupt it. Remember the RNC 8?
My attention was first captured in 2016. I went to the DNC that year, but I didn't pay much attention before that, I'm
okay.
embarrassed to say.
There was a group calling itself the RNC Welcoming Committee, who wanted to attack delegates, and they wanted to, and they did. But Minneapolis Police Department was monitoring them, and they ended up trying to attack some of the delegates. MPD arrested some of them, and a black bloc was trying to cause disruption, and members of the 151 FA helped, and another unit also helped form a shield wall to get them away. They ended up causing some damage downtown, but the RNC went off mostly okay. An 80-year-old delegate was sprayed in the face with bear mace, and someone else got assaulted, but it mostly went okay. But that's why there's so much animosity from people on the left towards Amy Klobuchar, because she actually tried to prosecute the RNC 8 under the terrorism statute.
I'm sorry, who attempted to prosecute them?
Amy Klobuchar.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. This quote unquote welcoming committee are actually DFLers, or just being extremely hostile and they've organized?
I mean, basically anarchists. They would be considered Antifa now, but at the time it was more of a anarchist label.
Okay. So Klobuchar tried and failed, and she's become some kind of lightning rod. This is all before my time here.
Yes.
I had no awareness of this.
She tried. She's not exactly the nicest person, but with a father like that. But here's the thing. MPD ended up conducting some surveillance illegally. So there was an actual rights violation that weakened the case. That's not why that's not why a lot of people were angry at her. They just thought the RNC Welcoming Committee was justified in what they were doing, and they were getting praise from people on the University of Minnesota campus.
Right. Yeah, the U of M is an interesting institution that, as far as I can tell, basically runs the state. At least when I look at funds being allocated in the past few years, particularly as pertained to COVID emergency funding, an awful lot of money went through the U that didn't seem like it needed to, in my opinion.
For people who don't know, the University of Minnesota is one of the largest landowners in Minnesota.
Oh.
And graduates of the U of M Law School routinely get elected to the state legislature. So there's a lot of connections on an administrative level and on a political level.
They often do a little time at Target University in between, if what I've read is accurate as well. You know, the Dayton family, royal family of Minnesota, at least one of them, as far as I can see.
So
this might amuse you. I found a novel. It was published in 1942. I think it was written by, I can't remember right now, but the title is Barefoot Boy with Cheek. Have you in your life come across this little oddity? So what's funny about it is it's written in this sort of hysterical satire. It's the only way I can describe it. It's way, way beyond magical realism and bizarre. But the entire premise is that the corn-fed children of farmers are sent to the U to be processed into promiscuous communist alcoholics. This is in 1942.
I mean, there was a huge labor movement in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. But is labor synonymous with communism, promiscuity, and alcoholism?
I mean, even in the 30s and 40s, a lot of people were making that connection.
Interesting.
Jack Reed and his ilk actually got a lot of support in the Midwest. And
I don't know that name.
okay, he was one of the major communist figures in early American history, around the 1920s and 30s.
Fascinating. Okay, go on, please.
So there's a whole history of communist sympathizers in the Midwest that generally gets forgotten about because they ended up losing support after World War II. And you only see little snippets of it again. But there was a Midwestern communist movement.
That's fascinating. I can see where your study of history is going to be the meat and bones, probably, of our conversations going forward.
I mean, did you know about the people from Minnesota who moved to Karelia in the Soviet Union to help kickstart their industries there?
First I've heard. What?
Okay, back in the 1930s, 1930s, the Soviet Union was trying to develop the Karelia region. You know that little bit in the north along the border with Finland?
No, but I can say I've been to the side that touches Mongolia. Does that count?
Oh, that's probably a fun story. But thousands of US citizens, mostly of Scandinavian background, ended up volunteering to work in the timber and mining and some industries in the Soviet Union. And a lot of them left after a couple months, a few more left after a year or two, but a few were stuck there for many years. And the US Embassy, which was full of communist sympathizers who wanted the Soviet Union to succeed, didn't want anything to do with Americans trying to leave the Soviet Union.
Wow. So stuck for years, and Jack Reed is one of the figures who was transformed into a believer by his tenure, or?
No, Jack Reed, I don't think Jack Reed ever volunteered to work in the Soviet Union. He just wanted communism in the US.
Ah, interesting. The last name is Reed, spelled like reading a book?
No, R-E-E-D.
I'm going to have to look this one up. Thank you. Well, if he's still alive, I bet he's pretty satisfied.
Are you talking about the current politician?
Well, my focus, I'll admit, has been hyper-local to the extent that I don't believe I can touch anything on the federal level. So my obsession has been with what I thought I might possibly be able to affect here, which has been nothing, but I tried. So, yeah, I believe it's pretty
John
freaking
Reed.
common.
Sorry, it was John Reed. It was John Reed, not Jack Reed. John Reed.
Thank you. But also communism has been reframed. I have a friend whose daughter works for what was till recently known as International Marxist Tendencies. Are you familiar with this organization?
No.
Well, they're organizing U of M graduates, and probably many other colleges are being targeted, but these people happen to be U of M graduates. They're somehow paying them, I'm not sure how that works, and moving them around the country strategically to try to influence other, college grads and people of that demographic to embrace Marxism. It just hasn't been done correctly, We're going to do it right this time, right?
I mean, it's leaving aside how profoundly insulting the idea of we'll do it right this time is.
Okay.
Oh, only Eastern Europeans could turn something as beautiful as socialism into a hellhole. Have you ever seen
Oh my
Cuba?
God.
So, in order to deny the stupidity of the ideas themselves, they have to resort to racism. Oh, well.
Oh, right.
But
interesting.
Something to think about is that where's all this money coming from? Cuba certainly has some tendrils in the United States, but communist China does as well. And while the leadership of Communist China may not really believe in the ideology much anymore, they still find it advantageous to back groups in the United States, like the Chinese Progressive Association.
The Chinese what association?
Chinese Progressive Association. There's actually two groups by that same name. One of them has ties to Communist China, the other doesn't.
How embarrassing. Maybe someone should rebrand. I'm writing that one down too.
So there's a lot of left-wing organizations that seem to be co-opted by Communist China, including ones that are ideologically divergent from them. So the official ideology of Communist China is Maoist. The main communist-descended groups in the United States are Trotskyite. But the Trotskyites have been working with the Maoists. And the Marxist-Leninists are basically a non-entity and haven't been significant since the 80s.
Again, your grasp of history, and this is fascinating to me. And I don't know the difference between the flavors. Can you break that down?
Okay. In the 1900s, there was a split between those who wanted to advance socialism via electoral means and those who wanted violent means. Those who wanted violent means became known as the Bolsheviks. And within that party, there ultimately was a divide between those who wanted socialism in one state. They wanted to establish a working system locally first and then try to take over the world, and those who wanted everything right away, forget about building industry, go to war right now. That was Trotsky's fact. Stalin was socialism in one country, build up a strong industry, and then take over the world. Trotsky was invade immediately, don't bother with industry.
And you said there's...
So the people who followed Stalin's view became known as Marxist-Leninists, and those who followed Trotsky's view of worldwide revolution became kind of disaffected and picking up ideas from various Western communist intellectuals rather than just regurgitating everything the Soviet Union said.
Interesting. And this divide began when?
1920s.
Or at the start? 1920s. Are you familiar with the Holodomor?
Yes, the mass famines.
Yes, in Ukraine, right? When was that?
That was,
which wing was behind that?
That was during Stalin's time. But that was after there were some smaller famines from when Trotsky's men would simply go to farmers, try to seize all the grain, even seed grain, and shoot anyone who wouldn't turn anything over. That didn't result in mass starvation simply because Trotsky's men were not able to do that efficiently enough. That's some of the cruel genius of the collectivization program under Stalin. When all the food is stored in one place rather than farmers' homes or outbuildings, it's a lot easier to simply steal all the food.
Yeah. So is starvation a glitch or a feature?
In that campaign, in the 1930s collectivization campaign, it was something of a feature because it broke the peasants who were most independent and resistant towards communist reform efforts. However, the inefficiency of the collective farm system meant that there was always a need to import grain and other agricultural materials for as long as the Soviet Union existed.
You returned to Romania as an adult?
Yeah.
So again, I'm just going to admit my ignorance. I'm not highly educated, and I wasn't very curious until about 2016 about anything. So was Romania communist in your lifetime?
Yes, I was born under communism. And I'm going to try to get that passport. I still have my
Okay.
passport with the old symbols on it.
What do those symbols indicate?
You've got the traditional symbol of prosperity, the shades of wheat,
Mm,
the rays indicating glory and brightness and hope. The it's kind of hard to see, but there are trees. Timber was considered part of the national patrimony, and Romania was famous for timber exports.
okay.
And there's some oil derricks as well. Romania was also an oil exporting country.
So is Romania wealthy?
No, because communism sucks.
And I can't help but see an intertwining between your personal history of being taken from your family. I can't help but see that as communist.
Well,
In
yeah, that happened
essence.
under communism. They didn't really have much of an idea of parental rights. In fact, they were kind of against that.
It really is so eerie to be talking to you who lived it and to be living through the period we're living in now, where it's so obviously nakedly an agenda that's being enacted, eroding parental rights.
I feel like ripping my hair out because I feel like my background says something about it, but I don't really know how to get involved in it, in fighting the madness going on with it.
You know, I think actually this could be the heart of something successfully communicatable for you. To try to sell your blue republic or your blue not state zone on your beliefs, however well-founded they may be, might be a tough sell because they're sort of esoteric. However, your experience having been taken by the state, I think would really resonate with a lot of the more or less still regular people and parents who might be silently horrified by what's happening.
Oh, I'm willing to speak about that as much as people are willing to listen.
Well, what I find here, and again, I'm not from here, I didn't grow up here, and I feel a cultural difference here, although I've felt a cultural difference or other, or like a stranger all of my life, no matter where I was to a degree. What I find here is that people are being really nice. And maybe that's sort of the case around the country. We're being really nice about some things, very polite. We don't want to have biases or prejudices or come off as biased or prejudiced. But I still feel like at the heart of certain things, for example, if you have not been captured by the trans movement and are sort of silently witnessing it, maybe watching friends and friends of friends and family members submit to it or believe it, I feel like there could be still, I hate to use the phrase silent majority because what's the value of that anyway and how do you count them? I feel like there's still something to be touched there, maybe something powerful about protecting the children. And from the idea of the state as parent and the parent not as parent and who has the power, who can make the decisions, like even eroding the idea of being a minor and not mentally capable of signing a contract or making a life-changing decision.
Oh, God.
These truths are self-evident, right? Still, to a degree?
It's one of the most foundational building blocks of any society. I mean, even when the Soviet Union tried collective childcare facilities, mothers usually refused to put their kids in them because they, and I think accurately, recognized that their kids did better with them rather than with the government-paid teachers.
Mm-hmm.
They say teachers, but I mean, when you've got one caregiver and 20 bassinets, childcare was not about teaching. It was about trying to get everybody fed and clean.
Right. I'm working in, I guess, a socialist program right now with children. And there's so many interesting things to observe. I mean, not just the children themselves and sort of the system I'm now dipping a toe into being a part of and kind of recognizing its features and its glitches, but also the idea of the needs of the few outweighing the needs of the many has become canon. I think I mentioned I was at the doctor, maybe I didn't. I have possibly a torn rotator cuff and maybe more because we are accommodating a child who cannot be mainstreamed. And, you know, God bless this child and God bless this child's family. My heart aches for them. But because we're accommodating, we've prioritized the needs of the few. We have serious injuries on my part. This child could have killed the child that was thrown off of this structure that I caught. And there's no policy change. There's no acknowledgement of the risk of that. And instead, there's this sort of concern, surface level concern for quote unquote, my safety. I'm safe. The children who are being thrown over and hit with sticks and stones, and they're not. And this to me also feels essentially communist. I don't know exactly how.
There's a famous quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. A criminal ended up trying to rob a Red Army soldier, and the Red Army soldier responded with lethal force. The Red Army soldier was convicted of murder because he didn't run away. And
wow.
Solzhenitsyn's analysis was that the communist state preferred criminals over law-abiding or basically honest people because the criminals were a way to terrify and confuse ordinary people, and because if the people weren't living in fear, either because of the state or criminals, they would band together and try to overthrow the stupidity of the system.
So is the name of the show Solzhenitsyn Was Right?
That would be a fitting name.
I can see it on the t-shirt.
He is getting quoted a lot more because his analysis of the Soviet Union is increasingly applicable to the current mess we're living in right now.
I mean, I don't know if you've heard of Bloody Mary, Mary Moriarty, our defender in the prosecutor's role in this county, Hennepin County.
No, that must have been after I left.
This person was elected, I want to say in the last 2 years, running on a platform of absolute, I'm going to do prosecution different. You know, read my lips, people. This is a person who was a defender who's been barred from practicing as a defender in the state. So now, with the goodness of their hearts, I actually have a neighbor who's a father and was a teacher, so a cog in the system and also an observer of its effects, who's scared for his children and actively campaigned for this person who you could see coming a mile away. The flags were more than red. They were pink. So this is a person who, I don't even know where to begin, and maybe the anecdotes themselves don't matter except to sort of diffuse my own outrage. We had a 13-year-old child who claimed that she was sexually assaulted by an adult relative who was also in the country illegally. This child found the wherewithal, plus her immediate family, to prosecute, to go to trial, to do all the things you have to do, to stand up and say, yes, this happened, and you can test my body and test my questions, all the things. Just the suffering of that alone breaks my heart, the courage of that. So finally they get to trial, and there's a procedural glitch. I hate to keep using that word, where one of the prosecutors passed a note asking how to pronounce somebody's name. And when questioned by the judge, the prosecutor lied about what the content of the note was. Now, the note's right there. The judge can read it, and does. And now you've lied. So Moriarty decides to drop the case on that. This person who's been accused of raping a child is now free to go, with, I guess, that on the conscience or not, depending upon the guilt or not. And the child and the family have to live with this. They just have to live with it. And that's one of so many examples of, in the name of greater good, this Moriarty creature, the tongue is more than forked. It's it's beyond evil. She's evil. And I could go on about kids raped in the homeless camps. I could go on about a lot of really ugly and unfortunate truths. But there's no will in this community to get her thrown out. I've personally tried to get petitions signed. These Stockholm Syndrome Norwegians and Swedes, the descendants of Norwegians and Swedes, Danes, they want nothing to do with it. Again, it's the fingers in the ears. If we did band together.
I know the difference between rural Minnesotans and Minneapolis.
I'm nodding.
I used to have my guard duty out in western Minnesota. They were solid, dependable people who are as shocked at that behavior as I am. And they would do something about it. But in Minneapolis, there's so much of a mindset of, well, it can't be that bad. Or, I'm sure you're exaggerating, an aversion to direct confrontation about a problem. Now, Scandinavia.
Well, maybe it's part of the nice.
Sorry?
All right. I was saying maybe it's the dark side of the nice. Like we're just going to nice our way through this. We're going to nope and nice.
A lot of Minnesota nice is really just passive aggressiveness. And the learned response that if you try to confront someone on bad behavior, you're just going to get socially ostracized.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a state of ostracism anyway. And pretty much COVID killed the nice as far as I can see, which I really appreciated. You know, just anecdotally, I enjoyed casual conversation with neighbors about light topics, but suddenly nothing's light anymore and there's no casual conversation really.
When I visited Minneapolis in 2022, places that I remember having been bustling were not bustling anymore. I saw a lot more dust. I mean, more modern buildings, but frankly, who cares? Nobody seemed to be out. And at the light rail stop, people seem to be consciously avoiding each other. I mean, it's not just the usual stand at least 4 feet apart. It was much further apart, and people seemed to be eyeing each other to see if they were going to come over. It looked like there was a lot of tension still going on.
Well, the light rail is a perfect example of the mismanagement that's endemic, you know. They run it essentially as a free service. I mean, free, unquote, because all of us taxpayers are feeling it. It's also FOIA proof, which I found interesting.
Oh, I did not know that.
I mean, don't quote me. I learned this when I first moved here. The light rail has been a topic of conversation for several years. Communities don't want it. Communities can't wait for it. They wish they put it someplace else. They're destroying wetlands. Like it's controversial at least. And it also is kind of weird that it also seems to kill someone every 12 months. A friend of mine's husband was a recent, thank God not, a miraculous non-casualty, but he'll never be the same. So every 12 months, someone's going to get obliterated. No one's going to get held to account. No driver's going to get fired. There will be no settlement. So it's special. It's protected.
There was a big fight about that in my time, and the deciding factor for the DFL was federal matching funds.
That makes sense. I had a conversation with a senator who was taking credit for pushing the light rail across. His name escapes me at the moment. He was super proud about it, you know, like, look what I did for you. And the truth is I moved where I moved in part because I was a biker and a mass transit person, although I always felt safe on mass transit before I moved here. I asked him if he ever used it himself. He seemed confused by the question.
Oh.
So that's for you people. I'll be taking my car.
I mean, that's a pattern with mass transit nationwide, that people end up running it and administering it without ever taking it. So the result is you see a gradual decay of mass transit infrastructure, safety, and comfort. And the administrators talk about expansion without ever understanding how it works, either as a passenger or really being in the facilities and understanding the mechanics.
It does. I wonder what, so you've heard of Agenda 2040 and probably other agendas with years attached, yes?
I mean, every so often there's a UN proposed list of objectives to achieve. And people act like it's some big coordinated thing, but it's mostly just self-important people spreading around on a stage acting like they're important. The important thing is not what's written in those documents, it's that it's more a reflection of pre-existing ideas. It's more of a proxy marker for bad ideas than the mechanism of implementing them.
Although I think there is an element, at least I'm thinking now of the WHO and their role in legitimizing trans as a sexual disorder as opposed to a mental disorder, which it had been previously. I think there's a legitimacy that's conferred by these supranational, unelected Davos attendees. I bring up 2040 because I wonder what the vision is for the city where they're erecting mile after mile of soulless human storage, just plywood human storage with unusable retail, almost endlessly vacant on the bottom level. And then they're ramming through these light rail corridors, assuming exactly what? Like, what is the movement of humanity they're envisioning? Are the people in the suburbs coming down here to visit the human storage, or are the people in the human storage going to the suburbs? You're
thinking that there's some well thought out plan. There isn't.
That shows.
It's more a matter of, oh, dense housing construction is more efficient. Yes, let's do that. Oh, mass transit is more efficient. Let's do that. And they're not thinking about how this works together, how mass transit is meant to move large numbers of people in a more efficient way, but becomes more of a drag if they don't have the numbers for it. They're not thinking this through and running the numbers.
Well, I find the idea that mass transit could possibly be efficient. Just as an individual user who worked multiple jobs and had multiple appointments, I was a user of mass transit. I did not have a car. And this was in a state where you didn't have to deal with whether that could kill you, 6 months out of the year. It's anything but efficient. And I can tell you, as a working class, working poor, mass transit, whatever, that your job doesn't care why you're late. Class isn't going to wait for you to get there to start. Like, it's just, I've never been in a situation where I thought that was efficient because I took mass transit. And I recognize that's not their thought process. They're thinking mass numbers of people. I get that. But as a user, it's anything but.
Well,
it's hours of your day.
Almost. It really depends. So there are a few transit lines that are more efficient and almost as fast as car transit. However, most of these routes are heavily subsidized and the political appointees are under pressure to keep on running inefficient routes and to also block private bus networks.
Interesting.
So that's one of the things that's making Uber interesting. They seem to have the political clout to run what is basically a private bus network without getting it politically killed. San Francisco allowed companies to run their own buses using regular bus stops for loading and offloading. But that also caused a lot of tension between the companies and the city because there's so much difficulty of building in San Francisco. It means that the city got clogged with a lot of private buses. So it became a point of tension between those who worked for the big tech companies who could get reliable bus transit and those who didn't, who had to rely on an increasingly cash-strapped public transit system.
Interesting. I think it's also being utilized here as sort of a de facto, well, I don't know. I haven't ridden, I'm not going to claim I'm on the light rail often anymore. But there is a consistent thread in my experience and from what I see online, it's just kind of, it's kind of a rolling homeless camp in a way. It's also kind of a go ahead and do your drugs in the relative comfort of the light rail system. They're not checking tickets, so it's clearly just a public service on the back of a taxpayer. And it's beyond unsafe, both for people who are in the group of addiction, publicly doing their addiction, and for everyone around them who's just trying to get to work. So it's just so sloppy. It's so egregious. Like, there's literally no effort made, to my knowledge, to clean it up, make it run at even something resembling a profit, to make it safe. If there's no games, it goes right by my house. It's empty. Except for, of course, people who might not have anywhere better to be.
I mean, one of the selling points of expanding the light rail was that it was more frequently patrolled by cops than the buses. So,
and I guess on its face, that makes sense.
Apparently that's been killed.
Well, there's testimony. They like to have these hearings. People can sort of air their grievances, and then, literally nothing changes. So in the grand history of that, there's testimony that you can watch if you care to. I think it was maybe 2 or more years ago now. There's a lot of attention on this topic a couple of years ago. The light rail drivers were testifying, and these people were shaken, not stirred. These people were in fear. So the idea that the police presence is something that's reliable and accessible, at least to the perspective of the drivers who spoke, some of them in tears, absolutely not. And it makes sense because numbers are down for policing, obviously, in this city. Who would want that job?
I mean, did you see those photos of National Guard troops with rifles in the New York subway?
No, is this recent?
That was a couple months ago.
Okay.
But they were put there by the governor because a whole bunch of train drivers for the New York subway refused to work unless they got better security.
Well,
so it was largely an empty show, but it was in response to a real safety problem for train drivers.
Wait a minute, are you saying a uniform presence has an effect on crime?
Gosh!
How dare you? How dare you? I had a conversation earlier today with one of these Stockholm Syndrome, third generation Swedes or whatever. She had her riot, we were chatting about it, which is a topic I take very, very close to heart because I'm a proselytizer when it comes to connecting the dots if I possibly can, although I'm more or less resigned to the reality that I mostly can't. She was talking about how they had a town meeting, and she lives on Lake, a neighborhood meeting, and how things are very dangerous again, and crime is through the roof, and people don't feel safe, and et cetera, and et cetera. I was like, yeah, what do you think about Third Precinct reopening? Because Third Precinct was sacrificed, to the mob, to the outrage, and remains so. Only now there's a sign that says cleanup is ongoing with distance. It's hilarious, because no, it's not. And she shut down immediately when I suggested that there should be police at Third Precinct. Yeah, that's like 3 blocks from your house. Don't you think that might help?
Son of a bitch. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Hey. It is what it is. Vote harder,
Well, I mean, there has been an effect in D.C. Treyon White, who made national news by being caught taking bribes, but the official charges are only one of the many crimes he's guilty of. He went through a measure to decriminalize fare evasion in the metro. Guess what happened? Spiking
what?
violent. What?
He wanted to decriminalize what exactly? I missed the word.
Fare evasion. People getting onto mass transit and the metro trains, especially, without paying.
Oh, that's actually the policy here, as far as I can see. Okay, go ahead.
So, hey, lots of people don't have to pay to use mass transit. Suddenly, there's a lot more violent crime in the metro.
Yeah, what? Huh?
I mean, it's not like we knew about this from 1990s New York when they cracked down on fare evasion and suddenly found out they were catching lots of people with felony warrants and catching people who caused violence in the metro. So
That's fascinating.
I mean, we learned these lessons in the 90s.
Did we though? Did we though? Didn't we just do it wrong? We can do it right this time. We're going to do it right this time.
Yeah, self-delusion, like hope, springs eternal, because it's usually the same.
Oh my God.
So, guess what? Cops can't arrest people for jumping the gate. Suddenly, there's a lot more violent crime in the metro. And now they recriminalized fare evasion, although still with very light mechanisms to enforce it. And now they're paying extra for armed security guards in the station and the trains.
You
So
can't make these things up.
Profoundly stupid.
Maybe that's the name of the show.
I mean, we had the experience of New York. DC ended up going in on a stupid policy that made mass transit unsafe. Despite all that knowledge, and this is before 2020, so it wasn't just a sudden reaction to the political controversy.
Right.
This was their slow, deliberate idiocy. Not sudden and terrified idiocy, slow and deliberate idiocy.
Yeah, well thought out and considered idiocy, perhaps.
I'm not sure if any of them really thought about the implications on mass transit usage from people being scared to use it. So a lot of these urban thinkers and aspiring mass transit technocrats are allied with the people who are the most interested in enabling criminals. So the result is they have all these plans for glittering metropolises, and they're allies with the people who make that impossible.
That's a fascinating insight and so well said. It reminds me, I was again talking with this Stockholm Syndrome woman this morning, and she was talking about property crime, and I asked her if she knew that they had changed the parameters of felony property crime in 2021. At that point, our county attorney, Mike Freeman, he decided that property crime under $30,000 was a misdemeanor, which under COVID protocols meant it was a catch and release. So these people are screaming at the cops for not doing X, not responding to Y, but the real why is, why would you think they wouldn't be doing their job? Have you looked at what was done to what the crime ratings are? Under $30,000 for property crime sure as hell isn't your car window getting bashed out. It's probably not even your car. And people just don't know. People don't raise their eyes. They don't look above, that thin blue line. They don't look above what's being pointed at and hollered at them with the greatest volume. It's so frustrating. In addition to that, this might be interesting because we are, of course, living through a crime wave, like so many are. He decided to create a policy of releasing certain offenders who had been incarcerated, presumably for good reasons. He had to let them out because COVID. So I asked, what's in place for their support? First of all, are they being tested for COVID? Number one. Number two, are they being given housing? Like, what, you're just opening the door and what's supposed to happen? No answer to that. These questions were not worth considering and certainly weren't going to be answered for the likes of little me. And people don't ask, well, what happened with those COVID policies? Who did they let out? Where did they wind up?
Well, there were some researchers who were trying to see if there was a predictable crime spike from releasing so many criminals. It turns out, yes, there was.
No, really, stop. I had an experience in 2020. Sorry, go ahead.
Welcome to government. It's profoundly stupid.
I can't disagree. I really, really wish to God I could. I wish it weren't true. But it is. It so is. So I had an experience in 2022 where my vehicle was stolen and recovered. It was recovered while it was being used in the commission of another crime. And it's funny because the people were filming the crime and they were debating, should we call the police? Because, police are bad. They ultimately decided to call the police. There was a police officer nearby enough to respond quickly. The person who had stolen my vehicle and was committing another crime with it saw the cops, jumped in, accelerated, jumped out and ran, and my vehicle hits a tree. Okay, so now my vehicle's an impound. It's impounded for weeks. I'd like to come get it, please. But no, they're charging me. I'm being charged, so they need to stall. Okay. I also had the idea they were processing the vehicle. I assumed that something had been recovered from the interior, but not so much. So when I got it back, it was full of weapons, everything below guns. It was full of stolen equipment and things. It was full of it had a robber's kit in it. It had a target list to go back to. I had an EBT number partial from a receipt from the trash left in the vehicle, and I had a first name for a COVID appointment. I also did some sleuthing and found out that these vehicles were being targeted by a local gang and where their favorite strip down alley was. I hoped that this would arise to the level of $30,000 in property damage, like all the vehicles all together, maybe. I could not give this to MPD. They simply did not want it. So I got myself a Sawzall and some so there was a lot of blood in there too. I forgot to mention that. If I was into meth, I would have been hooked up really well. Couldn't give it to them. So it's like everything's true at once. They aren't doing their job, but what exactly is their job? It's certainly not to apprehend low-level criminals who are on the public dole, which I found adorable as well. This guy is getting supported by me. Yay!
I wish I could act shocked and commiserate, but that's just routine enough that I can't react that much to it anymore.
I get it. And I think I find it to be an anecdote of a lot of things I don't like resignation and cynicism and futility and exasperation and what are we paying for? And of course, because the business base is collapsing and the retail base has collapsed, the property taxes are literally, we're gonna lift that levy until the morale improves, right? Like people are literally being taxed out of their homes. Of course, it's happening everywhere. So I say it with, I once had I am an optimist, but I once had an idealist idea about some of these things. Like everyone's doing their best and certain things can't be helped. But
I knew a bunch of cops in Minneapolis. A lot of them really were trying to do their jobs. And there was a lot of poor leadership in Minneapolis, not just from the...
Well, Arredondo was a disaster, sorry. I know it goes back further than that, but just for a comment, sorry.
But I knew a lot of people who wanted to be cops, who became cops, but they preferred to work with the sheriff's office rather than MPD.
For why?
Organizational culture sucked, even back in 2015.
Okay. Well, there is something to that, too, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds with my particular topic of homework, but we've been submitted to a consent decree. We've had Department of, I wasn't prepared to take the conversation in this direction, but the point is that there was a voluntary submission by MPD to a federal office like 8 or 9 years ago, where they came in and they did all of this work with the officers and the hierarchy and the constituents and the citizens, hours, thousands of hours of human labor spent to try to straighten up and fly MPD right. And the result of all of that engagement, it was a multi-year process. I can't even imagine the human hours in truth, never mind the actual dollars that might have gone into funding all of the outreach and what have you. It was Chief Arredondo's responsibility, unquote, to administrate the directives of this multi-year process, which he simply did not do. Were there any compensations for that? Yeah, sure. He's been taken off the stage. He's no longer forward-facing. He's gone into an interior position that's mostly decorative about historic housing, where he has a lot of power to control money behind the scenes and never has to face any scrutiny. That's his reward for literally not doing what he was empowered and responsible to do. And the result is that Minneapolis is in a spiral that won't be reversed, So it almost seems like intentional demolition.
I mean, it's so destructive that it feels like that, but I actually watched a hearing on the implementation of Obamacare.
Oh my God, what a nightmare that was. Okay, go ahead.
The DFL had a majority in the legislature at the time, but their representatives but on that panel, it was 3 DFLers, 3 MNGOP. The MNGOP were asking specific questions about how are you going to rate hospitals, how are you going to evaluate patient satisfaction as a priority, you know, the nuts and bolts of how you're trying to administer a system. Mm-hmm. The DFLers basically ended up listening to a long meandering monologue by a famous activist, applauded it, and then ended up making very broad pronouncements of, yes, Minnesota cared about universal health care before the federal government, yada, 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 yada. None of it was about the actual implementation of the law or how to harmonize federal law with Minnesota law. And that was the purpose of the panel. That's why there were so many people from Mayo and other healthcare organizations in the audience. They should, in the thing that they were supposed to be crowing about, they were not talking about specifics when there were literally billions of dollars riding on it. It looks like demolition, but I think it's just the slide of incomprehensibly deep stupidity.
There is something happening with the lowering of standards that is observable. I get these updates. I don't know if they're county, state, city, or what have you. I get a lot of them. And one thing I've noticed, and this is not opening every single issue, is that they keep lowering standards for nurse care. You can get a 72 and now be a registered nurse. You can get a 68 and be a registered nurse. And when you contemplate, again, the long-term effect of that and policies just like it, I see demolition. It's all in the name of something nice, I'm sure, something really nice that we all should feel good about. But the ultimate effect is destruction.
I mean, healthcare recruiting has been a nightmare and was even back in 2014.
Why is that?
Well, a lot of medical organizations actually have poor leaders. A generation ago, there were still a lot of people who had more life experience, and there was a much greater willingness for face-to-face confrontation and to actually maintain discipline and to do a job well. You do need some degree of face-to-face confrontation. There has been a generational change, and a lot of the people coming in do not have the same level of military experience. They do not have the same idea about how to handle interpersonal dispute resolution. And the result is that you end up with a lot of problems that slide. And when you've got about 50% of hospitals having severe disciplinary problems, like doctors accused of raping patients or staff, you end up with a recruiting problem. You end up because people don't want to go into a low-paid role with a whole lot of psychological weight on it and deal with bad management at the same time.
That rings so very true. And it's observable. I mean, I'm not seeking out like unfortunate incidents to witness when it comes to the younger generation, like high school, around that demographic. But I've seen so many meltdowns and just freakouts and shutdowns with this group of young people. It's so disturbing. And I don't know if we just can point at our phones and say, this is why, or point at our screens and say, that is why.
The phones are part of it, and it is to some degree measurable, but there's more problems than just young people and phones. There's a change in how people expect to resolve disputes.
So what are we looking at with this? Are we looking at the loss of socialization due to COVID? Are we looking at the loss of socialization due to growing up with a screen in your face? Is it a combination of these sort of desensitization yet like skin thinning factors?
The skin thinning was going on before COVID. I think it just became much, much more obvious during COVID. One of the things that makes I had a heck of a lot easier time dealing with people in the Minnesota Guard as compared to people at the University of Minnesota. Even though I'm very much a bookworm, I loved my academic time. The way people tried to handle dispute resolution was very different in the Minnesota Guard. And remember, I would say the Minnesota Guard was much more Scandinavian introversion than University of Minnesota. And yet, people in the Guard, if you have a dispute, try to address it at the lowest level, face to face. Stuff happens. You shouldn't get angry just because someone disagrees with you. The best way to resolve it is face to face and talk it out. That's not the way people were acting at the University of Minnesota. There was a strong desire for indirect communication of go to the website or I'm sure everything's fine. A stronger view that interpersonal confrontation was harmful and not a means to resolve disputes.
How very strange.
There is also
how dehuman.
It seems to be a national pattern. The left globally seems to be adopting communication styles favoring indirect communication, an assumption that flattery is friendly as opposed to hostile, and an aversion to interpersonal confrontation except when it is ideologically charged between friend or enemy.
Have you come across this, not concept, I don't know. Have you come across this, I guess, truth, depending on who you are, that grammar is hostile?
May you explain? Because maybe I haven't, maybe I haven't. I'm not really sure what you're talking about.
So this is part of a training. A buddy of mine is in direct sales. And they had a training, they have education that has to go on to keep their licenses current. And a recent module was on the fact that when it comes to texting, which is preferable for most people of a certain, I don't know, demographic, maybe everybody, for as I know. When it comes to texting, you got to really be careful about using grammar. A period is aggressive and maybe hostile. Better to end with a smiley face. This is something that was taught to a group of professionals in this state. So there you go. Keep your hostile period away from me, away from my eyes.
I have not encountered that yet. I mean, I've encountered the idea that for people who are, quote, marginalized, end quote, they may view correct grammar as a sign of officialdom and therefore hostile. But what you're describing is profoundly stupider.
Magnitudes of dumbness. It's part of the skin thinning, obviously. Yeah, as things become more abstract. What is that? Things fall apart. The surface cannot hold. Fear and loathing are loosed upon the world. Do you know that?
The center cannot hold. That's from Shakespeare.
I thought it was from a poem, but I'm sure it's been used more than once. But it certainly feels very true. So, Ciprian, what do you think?
I think as the older generation that experienced true suffering understood the importance of attention to detail and tried to resolve disputes via interpersonal communication rather than the slew of emotional warfare techniques that we're seeing now. As that generation continues to die and those trained under them who picked up some of those habits die, we're just going to see a worse and worse mismanagement. And there's the observation that we're in a competency crisis. And complex systems like mass transit, like healthcare, like science, cannot remain intact when there is a rapid slide in competence.
I've heard the phrase, and I certainly have experienced what appear to be a consistency of diminished returns and lowering expectations when it comes to things that once seemed easy. For example, I was trying to get into some back to work programs here, state and county. And just for one story in a nutshell that might tell the tale that we're both circling, I had an appointment at a particular office on a particular day at a particular time. I had to bring all this documentation, did my little hairdo, hopped on my mass transit, got down there, that office was closed. There was no sign, there was no lights, there was no way to go inside. They simply had all just packed it in for the day. And so I followed up in a polite and humble, I don't know if it was my mistake, which it wasn't, but I'd like to reschedule this. Emailed the person I'd been emailing with. I called the number for the main desk. I called the direct number for the person I was supposed to meet. There was no there. I finally just had to let it go. And these are agencies that are supposed to get people back to work.
I'm sure they're working from home.
I'm sure they're working it from home, working it hard. Finally, I gave up on that particular program. But it's nice to know I'm helping to pay them. I feel good about that. You know, charity does begin at home.
Oh, absolutely. And in the Soviet Union, everybody was together. And there was actually a satire magazine, Krokodil, that had a cartoon of a woman says, "Oh, you got a job from the job agency?" And the woman responds, "Yes, my uncle runs it."
Now, it's funny that you say that because I did have a strategy or an idea of trying to get hired by one of these programs. For one thing, I know what it's like to try to get back to work after maybe you haven't been working. And I care about outcomes for people. And I also can tell if I have an appointment or not. I can show up for it. And I really had an idea that I could help. And I tried to pitch my complaint actually as, you know, maybe you need staffing. I'd be more than thrilled to take whatever test or whatever training. But the training you have to take to get that job isn't available anymore. That was also a county program that they're just not running. So what does the name of that magazine mean in English?
Crocodile.
Hostile?
Crocodile. Crocodile. Crocodile.
And what is there a subtext there?
What do you mean?
Well, what does crocodile have to do with the Soviet Union?
I don't know.
don't get it.
I don't know
Okay.
why they picked that name, but the 1920s through 1950s was a time when people liked two-syllable names for a lot of publications.
Huh. It's an interesting observation. Can you think of another example?
Tripe.
What?
Tripe.
Are you saying tripe as in the lining of a stomach?
Tango, Romeo, India, Papa, Echo. The fish.
Okay.
But the way tripe has come to mean something cheap or useless or unpleasant. There was a magazine called Tripe.
Did you say, I'm sorry, Tripe?
Papa, Echo.
Okay.
As in the fish.
Okay. I'm gonna let it go. I don't want us to have to circle. I can't hear you correctly, so I'm just gonna let it go.
Okay. So I do not know why they picked that name for a humor magazine in the Soviet Union, but they were like,
but you know so much. I thought you'd be there for that one, but that's okay. I don't know either, so that makes two of us.
the study of history tends to result in more questions than answers.
Interesting. So has your study of history taken a particular focus, for example, the 1920s through now, or the Soviet Union and X-country, or just...
Well, back in undergrad, I studied Eastern European military history. I focused on the Soviet Navy, and I focused on the wars in the former Yugoslavia.
How interesting. And how did it come to be the particular focus for you, these topics?
Well, I mean, Yugoslavia was a country next door.
Okay, that was in your lifetime.
Right.
Okay. Interesting. And yeah, what happens when a country no longer exists? Like, does the currency get buried? Where do the bureaucrats go? Like, what happens in that scenario?
Well, a bunch of people simply left because they didn't want to deal with the ethnic conflict and the stupidity. In several places, the local communist bureaucrats simply became the officially non-communist bureaucrats.
Oh, tidy.
One of the representatives from Slovenia to the EU actually used to be an informer for the KGB. Not KGB, sorry, the Yugoslav equivalent of the KGB.
Sure. Wasn't Putin KGB or something?
Yep.
Yeah, I thought I heard that somewhere.
So they were politically connected under communism, and after communism, they stayed politically connected to the local governments.
It makes perfect sense. It's all just so obvious. I mean, not that I know the details, not that I know a lot at all about anything, but it just seems so clear. Well, Carlin said it, right? It's a big club and we ain't in it.
I mean, I don't know that show, but yeah, that's how a lot of politics is.
So George Carlin was a comedian who I think started in the 60s and he worked into maybe the 2000s. He's dead now. And I don't know that he's funny. He's more of a philosopher or an observer of bitter truths, I'd say. I haven't been a big student of his work, but that's one of the things he's famous for saying. And, you know, of course it's true. He told no lies, not in that one. And it does sort of create the conflict of how much of our attention and energy is it healthy to spend? Obviously you think you can affect an outcome since you're running for office, or are you running sort of for other reasons than believing you can win?
I don't believe I can win, but I believe that there's two things. One, I believe that by just being on the ballot and reminding people that there's an alternative and speaking in front of people, I can shift things slightly.
Maybe affect some hearts and minds, so to speak.
Right, because one party rule does not end overnight. People need to be reminded that there is an alternative. And that alternative is much more visible in Minnesota than DC. The second thing is because I am such a deep introvert, I have found that my ability to achieve things and to slow the momentum of stupidity is kind of harmed by my aversion to going out in public and speaking and trying to get attention for myself.
How is that part of it going for you?
Well, my habits have changed significantly since I started running. I'm no longer as averse to attention. I am much more, I feel a bit more confidence in asking questions and complaining. And I have actually found people that I can get along with. I no longer feel so isolated being one of the few Republicans in DC. Now I found kind of a smaller community, a very eclectic one, mind you, but it's better than what I had before trying to run.
Interesting. So do you have volunteers? Do you have a team?
Nope.
Just you?
Pretty much. Welcome to DC.
That's fascinating and so admirable. You know, it feels so empty, but thank you for what you're doing. I'm happy that you're getting some personal benefits from it. Do you really think the GOP is a viable alternative? Or what do you see as the viable alternative, really?
Most US elections run on a first past the post system that tends to result in two main parties competing for the handful of undecided votes in the middle. That basically means it's going to be Democrats and Republicans. You may have wings of each party vying for influence internally, but most of that competition is going to be under the auspices of those two main parties.
So you said that in Minnesota we have a visible, viable alternative. Did you mean the GOP?
Yes. I mean, I know it doesn't look like it because they're famous for being ineffectual. But when I saw the members of the MNGOP speak in that panel, it's clear that they were actually asking questions. They were able to draw attention to some basic issues. They even managed to get some legislation passed. And this is a bit inside, but back around 2014 or 15, I can't remember which, there was a bill on security guards that was being fought about. A lot of activists in Black Lives Matter, and well, it wasn't just Black Lives Matter, but I think the people who got involved in that were also involved in the fight over security guards. Were demanding that security guards not be allowed to pursue criminals who were running away. They had to de-escalate.
Right.
But well, it was a bad idea, and the Minnesota GOP ended up pointing out some deep flaws in that idea, and DFL politicians campaigned on, yeah, we have to make sure these security guards don't harass more innocent people. And then when the bill was finally drafted and passed, it was actually drafted by with the direct input of people in security companies, and took into account all the Republican objections. So they were able to point out flaws. They weren't able to change the public campaigning prior to the legislation passing, but they did actually change the content of it.
Okay. So that's hopeful. I guess I'm just
It's dispiriting
very
because
cynical.
welcome to politics.
Thank you. I was told there'd be candy.
I mean, this seems bad, but I've known people who ended up getting nearly assaulted because they were on the wrong side of a political fight in the Balkans. As bad as this is, there's still the ability to organize for open and democratic alternatives. People aren't getting beaten up routinely right now.
I realize things can be worse, and far worse at that.
And that's one reason why the riot in Minneapolis was so dispiriting.
Well, so maybe what we're talking about in a way has to do with acuity and competency. So I had a very, very obsessive sort of outrage over what was allowed to occur here after the death of George Floyd. And there were hearings. Again, we have our hearings. We ask questions. And across the board, the questions being asked by the GOP, so-called, were uninformed, ignorant, soft, no follow-ups, no dot connecting, no accountability, and no attempt to create accountability. At the same time, on the DFL side, we had a lot of deflection, defensiveness, and outrage at even being made to be there, because there was obviously a right and a wrong side. And the right side had a very valid bone to pick. And it was through a lack of preparation, a lack of curiosity, a lack of willpower to talk about the very, very hard things, maybe all or none. Nothing was accomplished with these hearings. In a world of any sanity and gumption, there would have been a grand jury, and Waltz would have been in front of it, and so would have Harrington, at minimum. But nothing happened. Softballs were lobbed, and that was it. And at least 20 more people, had died that week. At least, what are their names? I couldn't find them. So I guess I have this point of obsession that I acknowledge, but it's an interesting thing to recognize that the will simply was not there. Walt should have been politically beheaded by that event. And then you can add the other scandals reeking to heaven, feeding our future, his handpicked commissioners at the top of a lot of these criminal conspiracies or apparent criminal conspiracies. And there's no accountability. And he's appointing maybe 500 people to these invisible, untouchable positions every year he's in office. Think of the collateral damage of that, you know? So GOP changed the legislation. I'm happy for it. And I want to believe at least at the local level these things can occur. And I don't want to be a cynic. And I don't even actually deserve, I'm not entitled to be one. I haven't been through certain things. But it's just very hard to believe in good faith that any of them are operating independently, at least here and now for me.
There's a lot of timidity among Republicans in deep blue areas. And part of that is because there can be the politics of personal destruction. And longstanding political interests are not noted for playing nice with people who threaten that. There are ways to engage in roundabout ways to weaken a corrupt power structure. But by being roundabout, it tends not to get that direct confrontation that ordinary people sick of corruption are enthusiastic about.
Yeah. I mean, again, we're talking about the necessity of interpersonal confrontation. I feel like this has been, in a way, a theme for this conversation. It's so needed. And I read, what's the name? There was an event that I'm sure you're familiar with, probably far more than I. It was a town, it was after World War II, and a group of Marines had returned home, or military guys. And it was obvious the town was in the control of a boss, and there was a junta who was rigging elections. Does this ring any bells for you? I know it's kind of
thinking you're talking about Athens, Georgia.
Yes, steel trap, Cyprian brain. Exactly that. The Battle of Athens. You've heard of this, obviously.
Yes.
And what made the difference there? There was no fear of confrontation.
The returning veterans had more combat experience, but they also found a way to negotiate among themselves so that it couldn't be a clearly partisan fight between each other. They found a way to make sure that they had representatives who were from both parties, so it didn't just become you're just doing this to back one party versus the will of the majority.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did was technically illegal, but it was a time when there was a lot more tolerance of low-level political violence. It was not the ideal way of resolving things, and it's probably not necessary right now. But there were a number of murders in the 1930s and 40s, so the degree of violence, there was only a slightly larger than the background level of violence in that era.
An interesting insight. I guess what I'm thinking about is, so, people have their theories, people have their pet theories, and some of the theories I'm exposed to fairly regularly for whatever reason is that collapse is coming, civil war is beginning, it's going to be anarchy and violence widespread. And people that I hear this from, it's the same few people over and over, also seem to tend to believe that American military won't fire on American citizens. And I guess I bring this up because there is an idea in my mind that the only thing that can reverse the spiral we're in would be some type of open conflict, ideally verbally. I'm not advocating or saying I want chaos and violence and anarchy, but I think of incidents like the Battle of Athens and what was required there. I think about what happened to the Bonus Army. Are you familiar with that story?
Yes.
Exactly.
However, there's another way to look at this. People like battles. People's attention focuses on the battle, and they see, oh, things changed after that battle. Yes, but there was a low-level loss of trust as well. After the bonus army incident, there were always questions about whether people were doing that as a matter of genuine need or as a matter of being manipulated by a political faction. Or is this guy a general because he's actually competent, or simply because he's willing to beat up political opponents? And
wait, I think
the bonus army.
let's sorry, I just want to sort of brush over what we think we're talking about when we talk about the bonus army. What is your concept of what happened there? I'm getting lost there a little bit.
A bunch of veterans who were promised bonuses converged on the Capitol. There were allegations that a bunch of them did not actually need the money that badly, and that there was a process in place to pay it out. It was simply taking longer than they'd like, and they were doing it because they were being manipulated by communists and socialists. Another group said no, they should get the money soon, and the government was dragging their feet because they were more interested in other matters, and they valued paying off the industrialists more than they valued the people who actually fought. The general, I want to say MacArthur, but I'm not entirely sure, was in favor of clearing their encampment right away. And that kind of helped propel his early political career.
Okay, yes, but also Patton and Eisenhower were players in this scenario. And it's interesting, they all became prominent with no questioning of their role in what I think the common man might have seen as just suppression of veterans who had been promised money, and damn it if it's not the Great Depression or nearly, and they're forced to march on their capital to get it, and a certain number are going to die in the conflict. Like, just pay the men, you know? But I tend to see things simply.
So it's a very tangled situation, in part because it's kind of hard to assess people, the bonus marchers' motivations. And you can know that any general who participates in trying to clear them or advocating for it probably had a political motive in mind as well, because, well, flag officers tend to be political positions, not just a purely practical position.
Interesting.
And
okay.
MacArthur was famous, had strokes of brilliance, but he was also a massive megalomaniac and more interested in politics than the nitty-gritty of planning.
Oh, wow, okay.
So, I mean, was MacArthur's motive here a genuine security assessment, or was it just he wants to hobnob with politicians?
That's fascinating, and it feels true. How interesting. Okay, so once the villain, then the hero. But I guess the thing I was thinking about was the idea of organizing, and how are we going to vote our way out of this? I guess was my sort of general thrust with that line.
By itself, voting cannot dislodge a corrupt political elite. But you have to weigh your options. Voting in concert with other things can. Let's remember the corrupt clique of segregationists that ran the Deep South for generations was eventually forced out, in part because of voting, but also because of other stuff.
So I more or less concluded, based upon the totality of my extremely limited experience, that voting is completely broken, at least at the very top level, at least at the federal level. I hope against hope it's valid locally. I have no way to know that. And there's a lot of really obvious surface level things that can be added to the pile of why I feel as I do. Black box voting, Beverly Harris did her expose a decade or more ago. There's no question that it's extremely fragile at best. And there's also the administrative side where rules can be used to control the outcome. Kamala Harris was a key player in 2016 as Attorney General. And I could get into the weeds on that a little bit, or I could save it for another time. But I guess my point is that based on my limited experience, I feel as I do, and you have a vastly more diverse and dynamic experience than I do, and yet you still seem to think that voting is real, right?
Oh, there's definitely cases of fraud. Look up Muskegon County, Michigan.
Okay.
But voting does, there are a lot of elections that are contested, but actually administered fairly. There are vote fraud networks that occur that do end up disenfranchising a lot of people. But there's ways around that anti-democratic blockade. The administrative side is probably the one where there is the most need for honest and sincere people and attention to detail, but also the one that most people tend to ignore.
Well, exactly. Like voter fraud is merely the smoke. Like
no,
that is not where
it's
the
a real
fire is.
fire. It causes genuine problems. The Pacific Northwest would not be full of drug addicted homeless people and in the midst of a gradual economic decline if there hadn't been persistent vote fraud. But it's not the only thing going wrong.
Wait, was your statement that the Pacific Northwest would not be in the spiral that it's in had there not been vote fraud? Is that what you said? Interesting. So I guess I'm going to ask you to tell me more about that.
Okay, back in the 1980s, a slew of judicial opinions in California, Oregon, and Washington ruled that mail-in ballots were legitimate, and the interest in ease of voting outweighed any concerns over the ease of vote fraud.
I see what you're saying about the mail-in ballots. I still tend to see that as smoke. And I will get into the weeds a little bit with just one example that I believe might have a larger truth inside of it, because it can't be a one-off. In California in 2012, if you were registered no party preference, you got an all-inclusive ballot. Literally every candidate who made the ballot was on your ballot. And Obama won in a landslide. In 2016, the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, made an administrative change, which said that if you were registered no party preference, your ballot would not have any candidates for preference, of any candidates listed. All the parties, all the ones that made the ballot, you were going to have no chance to vote for any of them. So that affected approximately 4 million California voters. It was over 25 years now, 25% give or take of the total registered in the state. So when people began getting their mail-in ballots, some of them had the wherewithal to realize that they were not going to get to vote for president this time. So they filed a suit requesting that they be allowed registration to their preferred candidate's party on an extended basis. Not even up till the day, which is, as it is, you probably know, is the case in Minnesota. You can request any ballot. I guess they're just printing trillions of them in case somebody wants to switch allegiances on the day. Kamala wrote the brief, I have it, directing the judge to throw the suit out. On what grounds? On the grounds that there wasn't enough time. Period. So this is a case of like mass civil death in the state of California. And this double play combination between Kamala and Padilla sealed the deal. Now there was scandal following the primaries around like a tail in 2016. This coup de grace got no attention. And it can't, again, be a one-off. It simply can't.
California is a site for some interesting local phenomena where there's sometimes some very radical politicians where the majority of the people in that district actually are much more moderate Democrats. So there's, I understand that there's a quiet death of civic engagement in a lot of areas, but I still struggle to believe that those primaries are being conducted entirely legitimately.
Well, we agree on that point. Actually, the primary as it was run by Jerry Brown's legislature in that year defied the Constitution, which mandated an open presidential primary, and they ran what they called a semi-modified closed primary, whatever that might mean. So there's a lot of hinky business that goes on with rules committees and on up, as far as I'm concerned. And that's just really daunting. And it's hard to see how these things are occurring. For example, the anecdote I just shared, it can't be happening in a vacuum. And just the light doesn't get shined on it. There's like a lack of curiosity or even an opacity, intentionally perhaps, to shine the light where it should be.
Yes.
To me, with my worldview, Waltz and Kamala, a pair of perfect evil imbeciles, are both being rewarded for services rendered.
I think that's partially true, but I'm not sure if they would be selected on the basis of past services rendered, but, oh, okay, yeah. I mean, that's
well, with Kamala, you have a
president, not that, and they didn't foresee her becoming an actual candidate.
Well, they totally defied their own process. The entire selection, the shell game that's gone on here, and I don't watch mainstream media, so I could be talking out of turn when I suggest this isn't a scandal. Maybe it is. But they literally did a bait and switch. They did a shell game. There was no process to get her in that job. There is no acknowledgement of who's running the country, unquote, right now, as far as I can see. And these are questions that demand answers because on the inner circle, she had to know his mind was going. And she just bid her time.
I know this sounds hyperbolic or redundant, but when Biden disappeared for a few days and suddenly everything was transferred, and when he stepped out of the race and everything was transferred to Kamala, I just thought the coup against Gorbachev. Comrade Gorbachev just needs to rest.
Oh, right. Okay. So you're suggesting it was a coup?
I mean, yes, it was a fight over an election campaign rather than control of the country, but it really did feel like it to me.
I would argue that this has been really just a move to remain in power and therefore not a coup. Like Kamala just waited in the wings. She's under the control of the exact same powers that probably controlled Joe. And I'm sure you know more about that than I do. And she's just, she's the understudy. There was no real switch. And I don't believe there actually is much of a switch. I see the mono party very clearly, like a lot of cynics do.
But our election system.
I don't see it as a coup, unless you mean against our Constitution. Okay. I think I got finally to that point just as you were beginning to speak. Okay, I see it. Yeah, gross.
Our election system is supposed to elect individuals, not party machinery.
Well said. And I think about, and it's trite, but it affects me emotionally. I think about the generations who hurled themselves on whatever beach or into whatever jungle. And maybe they weren't there for purely patriotic reasons. Maybe they were there for anything but. But the point is they surrendered themselves, their well-being, their very lives to this thing. And, it's heartbreaking, really. It's so not what we were told, not what we were taught.
There's a lot of younger people who are starting to think, were we the bad guys in World War II? No. We were emphatically the good guys. But people are trying to assume or interpret people in the past as being as evil and stupid as they are now. And there was evil and stupidity in America and other countries in the past. But this is a whole different level of it.
I agree. I mean, if you look at the role of Disney in presenting training films and propaganda, it's the role of Disney in rolling out taxes to defeat the Axis. We're really talking about a very naive, unsavvy, whatever they knew, their wisdoms were real, but their subjection to new media of the time. And maybe it's just as powerful now, only it's a lot more degraded on the surface. But I feel, I don't even know what the word is. I feel like my heart aches when I think about these agricultural kids pouring into the cities, pouring into the barracks, pouring onto the beaches, you know, having been prepared by Disney for war. Like, it says something about that generation and their motivations and their sophistication.
That's maybe more applicable of the Vietnam era than the World War II era.
You didn't, how so?
What?
How so?
Disney was simply one media producer in the 1930s. People encountered entertainment more in the form of comic strips and radio shows than anything Disney was producing.
Okay.
Now, Disney did produce stuff. People did pay attention, but it was a growing company at the time, and not something that every kid had experience of. By Vietnam, every kid had experience of Disney.
Okay. Well, fair enough. Okay.
And that's why there's one scene in, I want to say, Full Metal Jacket or something else, where they're basically singing the Mickey Mouse fan club or something tune. Oh, well.
That's incredible. I'm going to look that up. That's incredible. So I guess when you sort of contemplate a globally perspective shifting question as were we the bad guys in World War II, first of all, consider the undermining of any pride in being an American, just with that right there. Like, what a deadly arrow. I work with a person who, she sort of embarrassedly admitted to me her favorite animal is a bald eagle, but isn't that too bad because ... You know, this undermining of any sense of good fortune or a lightning evolution. I mean, we're only so many years old as a nation. Appreciation for the sacrifices of the past, a sense of perspective as to the evils and sins of our founding. Like, that's all been sort of wiped away from what I can see. And there's this shamefacedness about it, about being an American.
The tyrants who want to reshape society.
This is going on right now.
The tyrants who want to reshape society have to blame the past to justify their interventions in the present.
100%. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
There's a great deal of wisdom in the early American Revolution. One of their ideas was that military personnel, when not at war, should take up a civilian trade. They should not lust for war as a means of financial sustainment.
Interesting.
I don't see any parallel to the modern day. No, none whatsoever.
Right. Wow.
And Abraham Lincoln's assessment of democracy and the dangers of political violence in his Lyceum speech, that's brilliant stuff. There's a lot of wisdom in the American Revolution. And in the writings of people who struggled with, we realize some laws are so fundamentally immoral, but that doesn't tell us how to set the duration of a patent. So the shift from natural law to positive law in the Supreme Court, there's a huge freaking story there. There's lots of drama and good and the challenges of living a good life in American history. And there are people who want to wipe that away because they cannot bear the wisdom of those who came before them, because they pale in comparison to that. And they pale in comparison to their own peers.
I'm sorry, I'm taking some notes. So it's the Lyceum speech, Lincoln?
Abraham Lincoln's speech to the Young Men's Lyceum. I want to say that was
I see.
1838.
Okay, and then you said natural law to what with the Supreme Court?
Positive law.
Positive law?
Yes.
Huh. Interesting. Positive as opposed to natural. I can't wait to look into this.
There was a whole moral debate over that I remember people still arguing in the 90s that, frankly, very few people have any idea about nowadays.
And when you say a debate, you mean like in your university classes?
No, just ordinary people.
Really? Think of that. Interesting.
I mean, that's one of the observations of de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. Ordinary people read books, read the news, and debated with each other. And I'd argue that the root of the country is not, the brains of the country are not the politicians. It's the people. And I think there has been a creeping corporatism, the instinct to treat society as if it was a body and to interpret politicians as a head, as opposed to what they really are, the digestive system.
Oh my God. Yeah. In my brain, you just dropped the mic. So I wasn't the recipient or the seeker out of a good education. And it's obvious that you were. What do you think it is in you that sets you apart? I assume you have a lot of people you can talk with on the level that you can obviously talk. So what do you think is the difference between, is it just curiosity? Is it opportunity? Is it something in your character that makes you want to know?
There's several elements. I'm pretty hard-headed, and I just don't mean my skull. My ancestors fled Russia because they disagreed with the handling of church politics. I might be genetically predisposed to a certain degree of stubbornness. So I will not be dissuaded easily by a lot of social signals that people give off when they want people to stop asking questions or stop thinking about something.
Okay.
I'm probably a bit naturally curious. I try to think in systems. And if I see a missing gap, I want to understand why there's that gap. And that was observed as a little kid. I don't know what caused that. But when I was in the orphanage, I wanted to lay out the toys in order and to allocate them. Okay, that might have been slightly megalomaniacal of me as a little kid, but I thought in terms of systems and limited resources. So thinking was something I did for fun. The teachers in the orphanage tried to teach me because I was the most responsive kid there.
Interesting.
And my adoptive father, when he adopted me, I mean, he would get annoyed when I kept on asking why, but quite often he did actually answer. So I got some positive reinforcement for my curiosity. When I was a little older, he took me with him to his Navy Reserve drills at the Naval Historical Center. There was a gut-deep understanding of the practical benefits of studying the details of history. So you don't commit blunders that happened in the past, and so you can learn how to do things better in the future. This was not history as, oh, some isolated curiosity. No, this is stuff people's lives depend on. So you've got to understand the details in order to do a good job. And remember, people die. I remember learning to draw on a Xerox copy of a painting, not a painting, an actual photograph of a submarine captain who went down with his ship rather than risk being captured and disclose classified data to the Japanese. People died. I was aware of that. Knowing things had a very practical tinge to the people, to the adults around me. And Marines, while they have a reputation for being gruff, were also prone to have pithy one-liners like complacency kills. A lot of people in that office were Vietnam veterans, so there was another practical tinge to it.
Interesting. So character and conditioning. Who knew? Have you thought about writing your autobiography?
I mean, I have, but I mean, who would read it?
Well, if you become a famed professor, which seems so, like, aren't you already a famed professor? I feel like you might be.
I can't navigate academic bureaucracy. I tend to be a little too combative for that.
Oh. Well, I guess we're not going to reverse the spiral in education then either. Sadly.
Well, my personality has always been more geared towards the military and bureaucracy rather than academia. I mean, maybe if publisher appearance ends up lessening and I can focus on just good teaching or good research, maybe then. But until then, it's probably not an environment I would thrive in.
I don't know that people thrive in these departments and in these systems in general. Maybe at some point they did. And I don't pretend to have any special insight. I've got a friend of a friend who's a principal of a grammar school in California. So I get some dribbles and drabbles of second, third-hand information that way. And I do some online reading. Are these bots? Are these AI? I don't know. But there seems to be a stultifying bureaucracy, there's that word again, that sort of is crushing teachers, crushing education itself. And then you add to that this dementia, this demented agenda with harming the children in the name of things that are good. It's just...
Yes.
I don't know what period you're living through. There's a name for this. There's an epoch that would be applicable, a term that's been used before. But it certainly feels like something was going on.
I doubt that there would have been this much the rapid adoption of crazy ideology without the stultifying weight of the academic bureaucracy.
And it's interesting to contemplate the power of the academic bureaucracy in general in, let's say, living memory going back to Kinsey, and also the sort of deviant direction it seems to consistently flow in. What's that famous table from Kinsey's,
Table
I don't know if it's his first
work?
Not the ubiquitous 33?
The children of table 34. The children of table 34.
Just horrifying.
Yep.
And then you look at the sources for his data. So you're talking about sex workers and other people who are, let's say, twilight as opposed to ordinary. And you have the canonization of the experiences of a very particular group of people, have a very particular experience up to and including the rape of infants. And you have academia excitedly embracing all of this as revelatory and essential and natural, and we all got to get on board. Huh? Shouldn't people be going to jail? I feel like people should be going to jail, not getting awards and accolades.
Kinsey was not just a pervert, he was a quack, but he was selling lies that a lot of people wanted to believe.
Interesting to look at it that way. People wanted to believe.
The 1920s was a time when a lot of people wanted to believe in sexual liberation, that there wouldn't be any problems from it.
Okay.
And things looked a little quieter in the 1950s, but let's remember, a lot of powerful men had a very casual attitude towards sex. Think about how Joe Kennedy treated women.
Sure.
There really was kind of a rape culture among a lot of powerful men of that era. And that persisted into the 70s in a lot of left-wing circles. So being told that having more sex, more uninhibited sex, justifying all sorts of people's sexual desires under the auspices of the highly respected science, the highly respected label of science, was something a lot of people wanted to believe. And the power of self-delusion is still very strong. Thankfully, it wasn't self-delusion about if we just kill another million people, everything will be perfect.
Mm.
But it's a lot harder to fight temptation against seemingly nonviolent pleasure than temptation about a drastic act like killing. The lies that Kinsey included were things that a lot of people didn't focus on, because Kinsey put so much effort into looking as if he was a disinterested scientist and not what he actually was.
Yeah. What he actually was. Someone who should have been put in the chair.
I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think about, with the perspective of history. It seems that we agree on the destructive force of the adoption and support of his ideas. Like it's a logical through line. Like maybe that's not the starting point, but we've got to be near the end point with this trans thing. We have to. I mean, I don't even want to think about how much worse this can get, how much younger the children can get, how much more harm we can do to them.
Someone sent me a link to a pedophile wiki. And I investigated it, and I looked at some of the arguments they were making. Actual freaking pedophiles were celebrating the rise of transgender surgery on minors, because they believed that if the general public accepted that children could consent to life-altering surgeries like this, they would eventually come to the conclusion that children could consent to what they believed was much less harmful sex. So the pedophiles were celebrating the rise of the trans craze.
Makes sense. Of course it makes sense.
Things can get very, very, very bad. And I think a lot of people who blindly trusted experts are increasingly aware of how morally and ideologically compromised those supposed experts are.
I hope. I don't know if your life has been touched peripherally by this movement. With this nightmare? My life has been touched peripherally by this. And a person I've known more than half my life is now either passively allowing or actively participating in the mutilation of their child. And if you had told me at any point before this was shared with me that this was the case, I wouldn't have believed it possible. Not this person, no, but this person, yes. And this is someone I would have trusted, to have my back or to tell me the truth, or, anyone of a reasonable array of things you can count on from someone who's in your life. But this is a dividing point, and now we don't talk, because if I say nothing when I have nothing to lose, what am I? So I said something. And this person I'd previously known to be sane and measured and kind and reasonable and not a homophobe, which to me this whole thing is so homophobic. Now I'm cut off. And I can only imagine how much further down the road this child has been taken. And, just that times a million.
There's a phenomenon where belief follows action. That's one reason why a lot of horrible groups like the Imperial Japanese Army would push people to murder innocent civilians in order to be completely reliant on the organization that could give them an excuse for what they did. You have people doing things to children who have to believe in order to maintain some basic positive self-image. They have been cajoled. They have been cajoled into thinking that these changes were not horrible. And now they have to believe those changes were not horrible if they are to have any ability to look at themselves in the mirror.
I think there's something too psychologically happening with possibly the youths themselves, but definitely maybe with the parents. I base this on observation and not an observation of a large group, but just some observation. I think it's the elevation of victimhood and the correlation of victimhood to specialness. Like there's something going on where it's a point of pride to be damaged. And it's something that you can carry in front of you, maybe as a shield for, let's say, your whiteness or whatever else qualities are now less acceptable or somehow degraded in the public mind because of history. I think there's something that's happening with the psychology of the victim as special. That's also at work. And like on a mass level, that makes it very disturbing. I have a couple of neighbors who are trans-identified males living together.
Bear in mind that
there's not a what?
Bear in mind that I have not read John Rawls' work in any detail, but John Rawls has a theory of justice in which a society was judged on how they responded to the weakest and poorest among them.
Okay, a theory of justice, John Rawls?
Yes.
Okay.
Now think about the implications of that, including in cases where that pain is self-inflicted.
Sure. Okay.
That may be where fundamental moral change happened. Because previously, victimhood was not something to be celebrated. It was something to be embarrassed about. But now it is a cudgel to beat people over the head. What idea?
Okay, so, wow. Okay, so here's another anecdote that I think contains the galaxy in a nutshell. I work with a child whose parent will occasionally announce that it's a special day, pronoun-wise. The child has never, in my experience, sought this out or referred to themselves with anything special on a special day. What I have observed in the child, though, is a pattern with another particular child where child A will accuse child B of bullying them. And the child then uses this accusation to literally bully the other child. Because adults get involved, we're going to ask why, and don't, and please, and stop, and apologize. But just observing them physically, these two, I can see that the interactions cannot be happening as the adults are being told. And there's an awareness of this, but there's no stopping it. So child B continues to get beat up, so to speak, by child A, maybe on those special days, maybe not. But the psychology of this, the victim is the bully. Again, it's about extrapolating it like societally and globally. Like, it's just so twisted.
Yeah.
What can you say? So it seems to me that we've had several conversations in this one. And it also seems to me that it might be a lot to expect people to sit through. And I don't know what the viewers are like or what your experience has been in your time doing this work. Do you think that the length is something to think about, or like keeping topics? Obviously, we're just beginning. If you want to continue, that is. But maybe trying to keep topics trimmed, maybe just for the time of the potential listener.
Yeah. I think most podcasters tend to stick to about 30-minute segments to break up it. They might have a longer interview and then break it up into segments that end up getting dropped on YouTube. The shorter the segment,
Okay.
the more views it gets. That's Ty's choice.
Fair enough. I just thought I'd mention it.
Yeah.
As a listener, I've listened. Okay.
Listening to his stuff is something that I have to set aside a longer period of time to do.
Right.
So maybe he's going to change the way he edits and drops videos. I don't know.
Do you have any experience with that side of it?
No.
Okay. Because I know that for the podcast, we're not even listening on iPods. I'm not even going to use the word pod anymore. For the people who I listen to, it's typically a listening experience only. But if they're going longer and there's a visual component, that could hold my attention and has sometimes held my attention longer. And it's obvious. It's not a big, insightful comment. But it's maybe something to think about in terms of if we intend to continue, which I very much enjoyed this. You're fascinating. Maybe something to think about maybe I'm talking to myself, trying to figure out how to add that so it's not on Ty necessarily. Just a thought.
Okay.
Okay.
Leave it. End the recording now, and maybe we shift to talking about details.
Sure.
Okay.